when did you first get interested in studying gambling addiction, and when did you realize the severity of the problem?
So, first of all, thanks for having me on your podcast. It's great to be talking to someone across the pond, as we say, and also fascinated to learn about what's happening there in the streets of Amsterdam. I grew up in suburbs of Chicago, Illinois, and I majored in college in English and biology. And I was always fascinated with what the human brain and the mind and what motivates folks. But I also grew up in a time and consider myself a Generation X physician. I grew up in a time in the mid 90s where addiction as a brain disease came about for the first time. So imagine
Okay.
1995, it's announced that, hey, people with substance use disorder, alcohol, tobacco, cocaine, opioid use disorder, there are things in their brains that are creating this condition.
Hmm.
Then, when I came to be a physician in Los Angeles, finishing my psychiatry residency right at the turn of the century, 2002, we started to see gambling really emerge as a cultural activity.
Hmm.
Online gambling, brick and mortar casinos, poker boom, and everyone would say, "Oh, this is an addictive behavior." And I always wonder, well, wait a minute, how could it be a disorder of addiction? How could it be an addiction as a brain disease if there's no substance being ingested to change the brain's structure and functioning, right?
Yes.
So right around 2002, that's really when I really got fascinated by gambling and the intersection on the body, the brain, the mind, the spirit, the wallet, all those sorts of things. And that led me to start asking questions. And ultimately, I found a mentor here in Los Angeles, a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Richard Rosenthal, who was responsible for putting the criteria for diagnosing gambling addiction, back then known as pathological gambling, into the APA handbook. And really, it's been 25 years of me asking questions about gambling and learning about gambling and trying to uncover its impact again on body, brain, mind, spirits, and wallets.
Super interesting. And yeah, I mean, in those 25 years, the landscape of gambling has changed significantly and is still evolving today, which we'll touch on later as well. But before we do all that, how do we define a gambling addiction? Because you briefly mentioned something about defining it. So I'm curious, what is the definition of having a gambling addiction, and why is it so important to have a proper definition?
So I'll start with why it's important. We need language. We need uniform understanding how to characterize behavior and tell a difference between when is it just expected behavior, when it's versus pathological or a sign of the brain's functioning gone awry. So we start with defining basic words, and that's gambling. So I define gambling simply as putting something of value at risk, usually money, but it could also be time, on an event of uncertain outcome in the hopes of winning a larger reward, but also recognizing a possibility of losing. So when you think about that, gambling is something we do every day in our lives. Do
Hmm.
I take this job or do I not? Do I take this certain road to work or do I take a different road? Do I break up with my boyfriend or do I stay with him? So these are just different forms of risk taking and gambling behaviors we have in our own lives. But what's changed in the modern day world is many, many, many forms of gambling are essentially now around games of chance, slot machines, craps, roulette, betting on sports, and things like that. So I think we too often just recognize gambling under that behavior related to trying to win money on games of chance. Then you pour into other words we use all the time: betting, wagering, and these are just different ways of describing different forms of gambling. However, people will say, no, a bet is like between you and me. It's a contract. It's not based on luck. It's based on I have a position, you have a position, and we just happen to put money against our positions. So all that, we don't call it wagering addiction. We don't call it betting addiction. We call it gambling addiction. And for years, we called it addiction, addiction, addiction. But the word addiction doesn't have a scientific definition like substance use disorder. So now in 2026, what I say properly is gambling disorder, which is in line with all the other substance use disorders, alcohol use disorder, tobacco use disorder. That's all outlined in our APA Handbook of Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatric Conditions, which was put forth in 2013, 12 years ago. But, when we say, again, the term problem gambling, gambling addiction, gambling disorder, we all mean the same thing, which is, again, a pattern of continued gambling despite harmful consequences. And that's it. I think people say, well, what's the difference between gambling addiction, gambling disorder, or just frankly losing money gambling? Well, gambling by definition is risky. So it's expected you will lose money if you just engage in it. So just because you lose money doesn't mean you, quote, are a person with gambling disorder. Gambling disorder is very, very different. It's a set of behavioral actions around gambling where it's characterized again. You continue to gamble despite harmful consequences. The gambling is the solution to all your problems. You experience urges and cravings and thinking about gambling to the point where you struggle doing other things. You ask for bailing out for loans. You can't stop gambling. You have tolerance to gambling where you gamble more and more to get the same thrown effect. Again, very similar to what we experience with addiction. I think if I had 100 men and women with gambling disorder come into your show today, you'd have 100 different stories of how their gambling disorder shows up. So unlike asthma or lung cancer or even a heart attack, where the symptoms are somewhat similar, maybe a little bit different, but mostly similar, the symptoms of gambling disorder vary widely from person to person. So some people come in and they talk about, well, I have all this debt. I've been chasing my losses. I can't stop gambling. I had to ask my mom to bail me out and I'm struggling. Others say, well, I gamble to escape my depression, or I just can't stop thinking about gambling in of itself, or I say that's it. I'm gonna slow down, and then I just can't stop. Anyway, so words do matter, and I think it's super important for people to say, well, do I or do I not have a gambling addiction? How would I know? We have to remember the vast majority of people that gamble on a regular basis, a couple of times a month, a couple of times a year, do not develop gambling disorder. We know about 1 to 2% of the general population have gambling disorder. So it's not so rare that it's invisible, but it's enough that the significant number of people, and that doesn't matter what country on earth you're at. A lot of epidemiologic studies have shown that range either from 0.5% up to 3% in certain countries. So it really shows you it's a human condition that, depending on what's happening there in your local country, might have different rates, but it's still very much a human condition that we see.
Yeah, and why I can imagine that a gambling addiction, I mean, all addictions are pretty bad. Otherwise, we wouldn't really call them an addiction. They're problematic, so to say. However, I would think that a gambling addiction is especially insidious because it can be very invisible, right? I mean, I know people who have struggled with an alcohol addiction, for example, and they can be pretty smart about it. People are known to be quiet about their alcohol addiction and they can suffer in silence for years. But still, if you're really truly addicted to alcohol, people smell it. You start like performing worse at your job. You have like bloodshot eyes. It's more visible. Whereas a gambling addiction, in a lot of cases, I assume can be a bit more covert. You don't necessarily see whether someone has developed a gambling addiction other than maybe looking at their bank accounts.
That's right. And that's when I first learned it 20 years ago. I said, well, how do you tell? Because they can look really fit. They can look like $1 million and they can look spectacular, but inside they may be experiencing tremendous amount of harm and shame and guilt and lying and covering it up. And it goes back to, again, just how we as humans think about money, right? When you have money, you're viewed as successful, you're viewed as someone highly skilled. When you lose money, or even particularly when you give money away to a casino or to an online operator or a bookie, you're kind of viewed as, well, only a fool and his money are parted, right? And there's still that kind of false belief that gambling is something that's a little bit shadowy, or it's a vice, it's only the lane for the greedy. So that's why there's a lot of guilt and shame to admit that, yeah, I lost it. But you're absolutely right, is that there is no intoxicated state of gambling that you can smell. There's a kind of an intoxicated state of gambling. There's a state of withdrawal where people are feeling miserable, or where they're feeling euphoric or high. But because they're not altered by a substance, it is impossible to detect, because we don't have a blood test, we don't have a urine test, we don't have a brain scan. And again, it's the guilt and shame of the harm of gambling that drives people to hide it. I've had so many patients say to me, you know what? If I had a drug problem, I just tell everyone and say, you know what, I got an alcohol problem, a cocaine problem. People would be like, oh, that's terrible. But hey, we're behind you 100% to go to the rehab, right? Or even more so, they would say, it's because of the drugs. When I was high on cocaine or meth, that's why I did those terrible things. When you're stone cold sober and you take out a loan, or you spend your child's budget, or you blow through your credit cards, when you're stone cold sober, you can imagine how powerfully guilty and shameful that is. And that's why I think people hide it even more, because it's just, no one wants to admit that they did these things to their loved ones or to themselves. Because again, we equate, when you lose money, you're not just a loser financially, but somehow you were a loser morally. You were someone who wasn't smart enough to stop. You didn't have the self-control, and shame on you for not knowing when to stop, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's terrible. And why do we as humans get addicted to gambling? What happens in the brain when we gamble, and why are some people more likely to develop an addiction and an unhealthy relationship to gambling?
So it's an awesome question. The way I think about it is, all addictions, all addictive disorders, why they show up is a combination of biological, psychological, and social risk factors. So when we think about the brain, naturally our brains react to all sorts of things that we're exposed to: lights, sound, smells, experiences, you name it, right? So the same thing is true with gambling. When people gamble for the very, very first time, the ones who have gambling disorder tell me, there's a genetic risk factor. There's family history of it. They describe, oh my gosh, I feel alive. I feel incredible. I feel normal. I feel like I'm in a safe space for the first time in their lives. These are all biological responses to the gambling experience. So what's happening in the brain is, as the body and brain are shown the gambling activity, the brain responds. And we do know that neurochemicals like dopamine and serotonin and epinephrine are highly involved. We do know that the neural networks that are responsible for attention, for reward, for self-control, for motivation, are all somewhat built a little bit differently. And I think that's the easiest way I can explain it, because I've had patients say, from the very first time I sat down at a blackjack table, I knew that this was going to be part of my life for a long, long time. It's very similar to when the very first time people say, the very, very first time I took heroin, I said, oh my God, this is amazing. I really like the way it makes me feel. That's a naturally gifted, given biological response. You can't control that. That's just what's going on in the body and the brain. So again, it goes back to this understanding: addiction as a brain disease, a combination of people born a little bit differently, so that they respond and react in very, very different ways than the general population. And then as you do that behavior over time, the brain starts to have adaptations. It starts to change in and of itself, so that it kind of it adapts. There's a wonderful a professor in Europe, Anna Gudrian, who did a tremendous amount of work on the neuroscience of gambling, and I think she came from the Netherlands, or out there, and she really has a lot of great work on that. But when I describe it to patients, that's how I describe it. I said, what's happening in your brain is, it's so rapid, right? It's really under unconscious control. So when you're faced with all the experiences of gambling, the lights, the sound, the smell, the anticipation, the game you're playing that you naturally like, your body responds, and responds by pouring out neurochemicals that draw attention, and how it responds. And things like that. So there's been neuroimaging studies, there's been genetic studies, there's been a lot of blood sampling studies showing that, again, the bodies and brains of people with gambling disorder react differently. As an example, one study that was a landmark study really showed that, folks with gambling disorder versus folks without, folks with gambling disorder were shown just images of money. In the brain scanner, there were different parts of their brains that were activated compared to folks without gambling disorder. So again, it's a combination. You're born differently, and then as you gamble excessively, it changes kind of the brain functioning.
Yeah, what I like that you said in the beginning is that we gamble during our daily lives. Should I take the job? Shouldn't I take the job? Should I break up with this person? Shouldn't I break up with this person? I think in a sense we we have been doing that for a very very long time. If we back when we were still hunting for food, we were gambling essentially, and a big part of that was the unpredictability. We are going out to hunt, it's cold, it's snowing, but we need food. We are going to risk it anyway to go out there, and then as soon as you hunt the deer or whatever animal you're chasing, you get a good feeling. You get this hit. The dopamine is driving you to go out there and seek for success. And I think that that unpredictability is something which sometimes a win and then no wins for a long time and then almost a win is something that casinos and online gambling websites have gotten so good at to supercharge our primal desires for this
Yeah.
unpredictability and success.
One of the greatest ways to reinforce human behavior is to give intermediate reinforcement, right? So that's exactly what gambling is. It's like, you may or may not win. You just don't know whether you're going to win the next time. And then you combine that with the idea that you could put a small amount of risk to win a massive jackpot, right? That's incredibly hopeful. So it combines both. We naturally will reinforce ourselves when we don't know when the next reward's coming, because that's interesting, right? We're just fascinated by uncertainty, but we know a reward's coming. We just don't know when. So imagine you're at a craps table and you're like waiting for a long roll, and you know it's coming, and mathematically it may or may not, but you hope it's coming, and then that's why you stay there waiting and waiting and waiting. But also that there could be a huge jackpot for a small amount of money, which is why lotteries are so popular, right? You just put a small amount in hopes of winning a massive reward. Well, that's incredibly seductive. But the other thing that, gambling operators have, they have a lot of things they can try out. So they can try out different kinds of bets, different kinds of wagers, different kinds of games. And if people love them, well, they can just pour more resources into them. If people don't like them, they shut them down and they go on to the next game. So they have an advantage, a built-in advantage compared to us folks who are trying to help people stop, which is they can just try out different things, and eventually, the ones that work great work out really great. Which is why the online gambling stuff I think is particularly concerning, because it changes so quickly. It's so available, and it literally does not take much resources to try out different kinds of bets and wagers online. It's not like you have to go put it in a lab somewhere. You can just program it differently and see if the public like it.
Yeah, and in preparation of our conversation today, I've looked at some numbers and some research, and one really interesting finding that I hope maybe you can tell me a little bit more about that is that they when looking at brain activity of people who have a gambling addiction, or it almost doesn't matter whether they are winning or losing. The same amount of dopamine gets released when people almost win or when they do win. Like chemically in our brains, it's the same.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
was really surprising to me.
is what we call the near miss phenomenon, that you
Yes.
almost had it, and that's what's gonna keep you coming back for more. And it makes sense from a survival skill standpoint, because if you didn't have that, it's hard to maintain optimism, right? It's hard to maintain motivation. I think we forget a lot of what gambling is. It's about maintaining hope. It's about maintaining persistence to keep going toward the goal. If the goal is to trying to win money and you lost and said, "Oh, that hurts so badly, I never want to try it again," people would never really take risks. And so on the flip side, again, why we have this gambling baked into our human condition is so that we can take risks, that we can try out different things, that we can persist even in the face of losses or adversity. And it's hard to put the two together, but it makes a lot of sense. And even more so, not just the near miss that's rewarding. It's the anticipation of getting into the game that actually very, very rewarding. So, for instance, a lot of my patients describe, well, it's, as I'm driving to the casino, I feel as high or as excited as when I'm actually gambling, right? Or as the anticipation of a good thing happening is also another separate rewarding experience combined to the actual playing in of itself.
And so interesting. And what does is it like some people are more likely to become hooked to gambling? Is that also the people that are, well, perhaps we've talked about like the near miss experience and people that are persistent in a way, which persistence is in a way a good trait to have, right?
Absolutely.
If you never give up and you've come so close and you've almost got it and you just you keep trying until you get it. If we take out the gambling, that would be a great trait to have. I think many people that are successful are the ones that aren't willing to give up.
Right.
So to me, that's kind of interesting that that same trait possibly makes you more likely to become addicted to gambling.
Well, again, think about so the psychological risk factors. We talked briefly about the biological risk factors, family history, genetic history, things like that. Psychological risk factors that lead people to gambling disorder are things like that. Things like having a high level of impulsivity, acting without thinking about the consequences, being primed to really want to take risks, being primed to really want big, what we call sensation, somebody who just loves stimuli, light, sound, smell, action, and who wants to be, But there are other psychological traits. One is called loss aversion, where typically we are all pre-programmed when we lose something meaningful to us, it hurts. It's painful, and we retreat and think about, well, we process what just happened. So
Mhm.
imagine people with gambling disorder, they take a big financial loss and it hurts that day. The next day they may wake up and instead of that hurt still holding them back from doing it again, that loss aversion is gone. And they're like, you know what? I'm gonna get it back today. So in other words, it's kind of almost being too optimistic or too hopeful. So that's another psychological trait. And think about all the great inventions of humankind, the light bulb, the internet, computers, whatnot. There's no way these things succeeded on their first try. And how many times have we heard those stories of people who persisted in the face of adversity or rejection or when things didn't work out and then ultimately it did, or maybe they decided to pivot instead of becoming a carpenter, they became a musician and now we have a great song that they produce. So psychological traits though that do lead to addiction are the same ones that can lead to spectacular success in other ways. So again, I've had so many patients say, yeah, I've been standing at a craps table for 10 hours, or I've been playing the slot machine for 30 hours straight. And it's like, wow, well, on one hand, we know that's obviously very addictive and harmful. On the other hand, if you can channel that strength and energy and persistence into something positive and useful, then suddenly that's called a good work ethic, as they say. So psychological risk factors are really unique. And I think that's when we try to do a lot of work with folks with gambling disorder to reduce the guilt and shame that they have, right? And we do that by highlighting, you know what, you have some personality traits that may have led you to develop gambling disorder, but those same personality traits could lead you to be really, really great in other areas of life. And I think when people hear that, it's refreshing because they don't think of themselves as damaged or degenerate or a loser or somebody who should be blamed for doing terrible things. And I think that's super, super important.
Yeah, if anything, they're optimistic and persistent, which I would think of as very good traits to have if you take out the gambling. If we look at the whole landscape of gambling, how has it evolved since you've started to become interested in researching gambling addiction? Yeah, where did we start 25 years ago, and what were some of the watershed moments during that time that really amplified the gambling epidemic as we know it today?
So a couple of things to keep in mind. So at least in America, we've always had a very interesting and complex relationship around legalized gambling. Our country was founded around gambling. That funded the 13 colonies. We had uh, California Gold Rush and the desire to go make for a better life. Just coming to America is a massive gamble for a lot of folks. So gambling's always been
The
in kind
American
of
dream.
American culture. But we've had waves of it where we've promoted it, we prohibited it, we've allowed it, we've forbidden it. But really since, you know, early 2000s, where we've now, I'd say in the last 20 years, have normalized and allowed legalized gambling to enter American culture everywhere. So fast forward even more so in the last 5 or 6 years, where we've now allowed sports betting and other forms of gambling on our phones, where to the point where we now have right now every single phone in America, and essentially in the world, is able to gamble on some form of gambling activity, whether it's legal or illegal. It's there. And so you back all that up to we've changed what the world looks like. We now made gambling on games of chance an expected part of our daily lives, not just allowable, not just normalized, but it's expected. So that's a huge part. So it's kind of like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. People expect it to be as on their phones. The big watershed moments in gambling studies over the last 30 years, I think, was really moving gambling, problem gambling, from the idea that this was kind of an impulse control disorder, we're not sure what this is, into the category that we know that for some folks, it is an addictive disorder. It is no different than drug and alcohol addiction. So that really changed how we viewed it. Then I think number two is this idea that gambling is a public health issue, meaning we regulate gambling like we regulate food and air quality and water safety, right? And why do we regulate it? Because it's risky, because there's money involved, and we want games of chance to be run fairly, and we don't want consumers to be, cheated out of their money and things like that. We also want to make sure that people don't use this as a way of moving money illegally. There are all sorts of reasons why we regulate it. So you fast forward to where we're at right now is, I would argue, the biggest step is that gambling is part of the public health lifestyle. It affects our economy. It affects our mental health. It affects relationships. It affects how people spend their time. It affects, and in partnerships, all sorts of different businesses that are now partnered together, sports leagues, advertisers, internet, tech companies, software companies, credit cards, banks, payment processors. A lot of the fabric of society is a run around just gambling behavior. So that's why it really is a public health issue, like food quality and air safety. So now I think that those are some of the big watershed moments. But I think we're in this world where, again, gambling and using money to wager on things, whether it's sports, politics, video games, TV shows, are just baked into the world order. There's very few countries left that literally do not have brick and mortar casinos. And there's very few countries that don't have access to the internet where you can gamble online on a variety of things. And I think that's so fascinating to me, is that you know, where you're at in Amsterdam versus where I'm in Los Angeles, we can access literally hundreds, if not thousands, of gambling websites across the world and pour our real money into these things today.
Yeah. I mean, I think anyone who has ever looked into starting or developing a habit, whether well, usually positive, maybe for the people that have read Atomic Habits by James Clear, they will know that in order to form a habit, you want to remove friction. Or you can also do the inverse. If you want to stop a bad habit, you want to increase the friction. I would assume that having gambling websites on our mobile phone, well, I don't assume, I know that removed a lot of the friction. Back in the day, you had to drive all the way to the casino. And yeah, it takes time. You have to physically be there. And now that we can gamble on our mobile phones, I think that's probably, yeah, kickstarted a lot of these numbers. Is that also visible in the numbers of the amount of people that have a problem with gambling? Can we see those moments in time, like this is when we were able to start doing it on our phones, and this is the amount of people that have a problem with gambling go up? What do those numbers look like, and what does
Yeah,
the
and
trend say?
we're starting to see that impact. It really starts, look, our smartphones, what, like 2010, 2012, something like that. Here in America, sports betting legalized or allowed for states to be legalized starting in 2018, so 7 years later. Every few months, we see more and more gambling operators opening up their business because technology is easier and faster with AI. You do all that. Again, the frictionless isn't just gambling websites, right? It's the ability to move money in and out of gambling websites. So if you had no ability to move money, then it doesn't matter how many gambling websites you have, right? So imagine you had a gambling website, but they're like, oh, in order to deposit money, you got to send a check and wait 4 to 6 weeks for your account to open. Well, that's not what we have here today. So we really forget that. The gambling websites are easy, and it's also easy to move money in and move money out. That's where the frictionless part goes away. The part that's even more under the next level of reducing friction is the teaser, getting people to not only just log on, but just here's a notification. Do you want in on this action? Do you want this bet? All you got to do is hit yes. So if you reduce that ability, you don't have to log on anymore. You just literally have a notification, click yes or no. That's even less frictionless. I imagine a day where it'll be not even on the phone, where it'll be either embedded in your glasses, like your meta glasses, or in your embedded chip in your arm or in your thought. That's science fiction, but where we might get there. So you put all together, what do we know? We know that gambling addiction prevalence rates have changed, and they're changing faster than we can keep up. In America, we don't have a lot of great early detection warning signs. We don't have a lot of money poured into monitoring epidemiologic studies of incidence and prevalence of gambling disorder. But we have some, and the few things that we know are the following. In every state in the United States of America, there's been increases in the number of people asking for gambling treatment help by when folks call the gambling helpline or when they Google gambling addiction help. We've seen those numbers rise up. We've seen more and more folks come into treatment. We also have seen a few states that have done surveys before they introduced mobile gambling and then after. Shockingly or not shockingly, you see those incidence and prevalence rates go up by a couple percentage points. Where I grew up in the state of Illinois, that number was like 4%, and that was much higher than previous epidemiologic studies survey. So, but we don't need, fancy PhDs to know that, is that when you have more access to an addictive behavior, you're going to have more addiction because you're going to expose the people who are biologically, psychologically, and socially vulnerable to that product. It's no different than if you had heroin delivered into the front door of every house 3 times a day. And eventually they're going to rise the number of people having problems with heroin if that can't happen. So again, but when you focus on the good stuff, is that again, the vast majority of folks are not going to develop full on blown gambling disorder. But that doesn't mean they're not going to be harmed. So I think we forget that, is that you can still incur a degree of harm by just spending money on these products. And although you may not meet criteria for a gambling disorder, you may still end up spending a couple $100 more than you intended. So there was a recent survey I saw that showed that the average United States sports bettor online was spending about $3,500 a year on sports betting.
The
What does that mean?
average.
The average. I mean, again, we
Wow.
have no idea what their incomes were. We have no idea how those $3,500 spent impacts their financial health or their mental health. But that's still a pretty significant amount of money.
It's a
And we
nice
know that,
holiday.
yeah, we know that the law of the few probably predominates, where the big vast majority of revenue driven by gambling is probably still on the backs of the folks who are gambling disorder, or really into this stuff. So you put it all together, it makes for some really interesting questions. And I think, instead of saying, "Oh my gosh, what are we going to do because it's everywhere," it's actually empower ourselves and empower the people around us to say, "Hey, it is everywhere, and here's what you need to know. Don't fear it. Don't run away from it. Don't get too deep into it, but stay curious about what this product is." And, it's kind of like the same thing where, 30 years ago, the internet wasn't spread throughout, right? Now the internet is, and we've all kind of learned how to deal with the internet, and we're still learning, but we see a lot of, positives and negatives attached to it. So I think the same thing holds true for gambling and increased access to gambling. We really need to just educate and empower ourselves to really understand what we want our relationships around gambling to look like.
Yeah, we legalized gambling in the Netherlands, or online gambling, I should say, in 2021. It was illegal, and then we decided to legalize it
Mhm.
because, so thought the government, people are going to gamble anyway. So currently they're doing that from illegal websites. So if we just legalize it, then at least we have some sort of control over it and we know what's happening, which on paper makes sense. I mean, our government did the same for cannabis, for example, and that turned out to work pretty well. I mean, we don't really have a lot of people who have a problematic relationship with cannabis in the Netherlands. Like, there are some people, but it's not a crazy problem, and it's been legal here for a long time. So I understand the reasoning, but it's not what happened with gambling at all. As soon as it was legal, uh, hundreds of thousands of new users entered the market, predominantly very young people from 18 to 25 years old. Those were, yeah, the majority of the new users, and it created real problems. There were so many people who got into debt, and then this was also part of my research when I still worked for the Dutch news. Pretty soon, the government understood that they messed up, and that at least they had to ban advertisements on betting, on gambling,
Mhm.
or at least very strictly regulate it. So we saw, and that's what we found out by, I don't know, you have something similar in the US. I believe it's called the Freedom of Information Act or something, that anyone can just ask for certain documents. So me and a colleague did that, and we saw that there were all these big gambling companies. They were lobbying, so they were directly included in the legislation process to help shape the anti-gambling advertisement laws, which
Yeah.
was insane to me.
Yeah.
And they were far more, they had far more influence than anyone on the prevention side. So any prevention, addiction prevention experts, the gambling website had far more influence. And I will say now it's pretty strictly regulated, and I think things are fine now. But to me, it's just so incredible that it was illegal, decided to legalize it, and we just introduced gambling to so many young people.
And
It's
was that
astonishing.
sports betting, or was that online casino games, or what type of
I-
gambling
It's
op?
both. It's both. So We there it was both sports betting and online casino games, just both at the same time. Do you think what one of the two is there is one of those more problematic than the other?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, possibly. The way we think about it is, for instance, um, in America, sports betting encompasses a wide number of different kinds of bets and wagers, right? The one that's the most popular is what we call the same game parlay, where you put a small wager down, you bet on 4, 5, 6, 7 different things to happen in one game, and you might get a much larger payout. That's much more random, and the odds on winning that are much, much lower than, say, traditional sports betting, where you bet your team versus another team to win or lose. So, depending on the type of wagering and bets, I think the odds obviously are much more favorable, depending or unfavorable. The concern with traditional online casino gambling, like blackjack and poker and dice and roulette and slots, is that the longer you play, there's a much greater the odds are very clearly in the favor of the casino and the house, right? So that's why there is a potential where those games over a long run are going to be profitable. Versus if you only bet on sports, betting only on winners or losers, you could actually, the odds for the house are actually much lower. So it's a mixed message, but I think it goes back to, again, the type of bets that are being offered. What you're highlighting there is just that simple story. Again, here's a product and here's an activity that by nature, by definition, is risky. It's supposed to be risky. It's supposed to create uh, questions. You're not supposed to win. And I think that's part of the problem. The advertisement is false. When it says, oh, everyone's a winner and you can win big and, there are people with special skill on it, that creates a narrative that's not true. This is entertainment. We never question how much it costs to spend on a ticket to see a soccer game or a football game or have a nice meal, right? But we don't question how much should I spend on gambling. We say, how much can I win, or how much am I willing to lose, instead of using the word spend. But very simply, again, why that matters is this: is that here are these folks that come in and are expecting gambling to be a moneymaker for them, see gambling as a job, see gambling as a way of bettering their lives financially, see gambling as an investment. None of these are true. That's where the advertising comes in. If the advertising is blatantly false or misleading, it shows only parties and fun and wonderful times, that's kind of like, false advertisement that drives false expectations. So instead, though, I think regulating it is super critical, because there's a huge difference between regulated gambling markets and unregulated. So the problem, though, I think, is that the average consumer can't tell the difference between what's a regulated casino gambling operator versus what's unregulated. And why I'm so concerned about unregulated is because, of course, no protections for players, no tax revenue back to the government, no education, no guarantees to the player that they're going to get paid out. So a lot of my patients, when I say to them, "Well, why do you still insist on using unregulated gambling websites?" And they'll say, "Well, I could be anonymous. I don't want people to know. They offer better games than the regulated ones. It's just easy." Someone frankly said to me, "Oh, I had no idea it was unregulated because they look really, really good." So in Amsterdam, did they reverse position and say we no longer are offering regulated online gambling, or they just tightened up the ads and things around it?
It's still legal. Like certain platforms are illegal, such as we recently decided that Polymarket, for example, which is a prediction market platform, but we ruled that it is a gambling platform for sure. So we banned Polymarket, for example. You can still access it through VPN and stuff, but it's almost impossible to get your money out too. We've briefly discussed friction, but you have to use crypto, and then the Dutch crypto websites will not allow you to deposit crypto from Polymarket. So there's a lot of friction there.
Mhm.
But I'd argue like most of the just traditional gambling websites, they're all still perfectly legal. You can wait, I can log on right now and wager on I don't know, Korean volleyball, women's Korean volleyball. I don't know, whatever
Yeah.
random sport comes to mind, but it's very easy, and they did nothing to well they did a few things, right? So first of all, they banned advertising, but also they made it more they gave some responsibilities to the platform, that if they noticed that people were logging on a couple times a week, that they would get have to send out these warning messages, and they would like have to get in touch with them. Are you sure that you still want to continue to play? And there's also people can also enroll to exclude themselves from these websites. So if you recognize that you have a problem and you can't control yourself, you can basically ban yourself from all websites. So there's definitely we definitely made some progress, but we made progress after we legalized something that shouldn't have been legalized, in my opinion.
Right.
I mean, shouldn't it have? I don't know. I think I don't know if I'm for a full ban against gambling, because I do think, for example, I have gambled. I have gambled maybe I gamble maybe once or twice a year, and usually it goes something like this: when I'm watching a football game or some other sports event together with friends, it will be a social event, and in order to raise the stakes, in order to make the game more exciting to watch, we'll put down some money, and it'll be more fun, more
Yeah.
exciting, you
So you
know?
get a little
And
more dopamine, you get a little bit more action, and you're willing to spend a certain amount for an enhanced form of entertainment.
yeah, some skin in the game.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, but to me, like that, I I think that's fine, but I do also think that a lot of people are, yeah, it's not for everyone. So I think it's a very difficult issue. That's why I'm not sure if I would be for a ban on all casinos, or whether we should just ban advertising. What is your take on this?
So again, it's we getting rid of all online gambling is impossible.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to happen. The technology is just too fast. So I think again, if I were running a government, I'd say no, we have to offer some parameters for safety for the public. And we have to take it seriously to shut down the ones that are affecting the public health of our folks who are going into unregulated space. I think absolutely from everything around it, though, needs to be looked at. Advertising in a way that's thoughtful, truthful, and not false is super important. Enforcing it and the rules that you create are super important. So that means from the operators to do it safely, to the users, to the people that pay money, all that needs to be done safely and quickly, and have it there. And then lastly, again, shutting down the unregulated operators, to say we take this so seriously to protect our citizens that if you try and do this in our country, we're gonna say, "No, you're not gonna allow to do it," because we believe this product is so important that we don't want to see this happen again. If I were running and making illegal, alcohol and selling it in the Netherlands and shipping it out, they eventually would shut me down. If I were selling cannabis that I made here in US and brought it in the Netherlands and sold it without properly, I would get arrested. It's the same thing. It's just a different product. It's a digital product, which is very, I think sometimes people have a hard time wrapping themselves around. So you remove the morality, you remove the what you believe, and just say, this is what people do. And then we embrace what people do, but we do a better job of educating people at the very beginning of how to do it. The problem that I see for at least my patients, by the time they come see a gambling addiction treatment person like myself, things are really severe. It's been years that have been going on with these behaviors of lying and chasing losses and running up debt and spending way more than they intend. And so that by the time they come in, we're talking about 80, 100, $200,000 of money gone. Really horrible things like cancer spread to the all the parts of the body. Instead,
Mhm.
what we would like to do is educate people from across the lifespan, whether you're young or you're an adult or you're middle age or you're an older adult, about what these gambling opportunities can and can't do. What you just described there, you kind of naturally just found on your own. And you said, you know what? This is going to be part of my life a little bit, but it's not so captivating to me. It's not so stimulating to me. It's not so activating to me that I want this every day in my life, or I want it more and more. I'm not turning it to it as a way to deal with my own stress. That's what I'm hearing from you, Julius. And thank you for sharing that. And I think that's where some people naturally can manage that. Others, though, who are biologically, psychologically vulnerable, as they get introduced to gambling, that's not what happens. They get into it, they get excited, they start chasing losses, start developing a firm relationship with it. And nowhere along the way does someone intervene. And that's really where we hope someone would. Maybe it's the gambling operator. Maybe it's the payment person saying, hey, we notice you're really spending a lot of time and money, and we really want you to think twice before you do more. Maybe it's a healthcare provider. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe again, it's a father teaching a young son or daughter about what these things are and aren't. One of the biggest things we have here in California or America, that many of the young people that are gambling are doing so because their parents are allowing them to gamble. The parents are the ones giving them their password and login. So, in other words, the parents themselves don't realize how potentially harmful or addictive this could be. They just think, oh, it's normal. So those are the sorts of things that, when you go back to like, what can we do? We really can do a lot better job of educating everybody what these things are and aren't, and just basically following the rules that we set forth. So, again, and we've seen some countries have buyer's remorse. I don't know what Australia did when it came to spread of video poker machines, and they put them out there. They created some social harm. They yanked them back. But when it comes to online gambling, I think it's so difficult because, again, even if you clawed it back and said, we no longer want this legal, it's going to still spread. It's just too easy on the unregulated side because there's literally, it doesn't take much energy. Just, you and I could put together, if we had a little bit of computer knowledge and ability. And now, particularly with AI that can generate all of this software and all these numbers and stats that can put bets out, right? I think that's the thing about a lot of these sports betting apps. You don't have 24/7 gambling if you can't generate betting lines, right? So in the old days, it was a human, writing on a board, teams and how much they're going to win by. Now it's all computer generated to generate betting options and availability. That's, I think, the story a lot of times people don't recognize is that it's not like some human cranking out these odds. It's all automated software.
Yeah. No, for sure. And one thing before I really want to touch on some of the treatments, but before we do, one thing I was curious about, are men more likely to have a problem with gambling, or is it pretty even distributed?
Yeah, we see the trends are still predominantly more biological men than biological females developing gambling disorder. Um, there's lots of speculation as to why, but it's not the way I think about it. It's not that females are not. They're still gambling, but they're gambling on different types of games, and oftentimes I think they're having signs and symptoms that are oftentimes much even more hidden and harder to come out. So, but biologically, yeah, there's something different about the male brain that where the appeal of games and award or reward instantly, instant gratification, getting stuff, power, competition, that sort of thing that's kind of celebrated. But it's reinforced by, cultural stereotypes and again by the advertisings and things like that.
Sure, sure. Yeah. No, but I do know a lot of I have a lot of friends who really enjoy gambling. Some of them, I mean, not so much anymore, at least not visibly, but I used to have some friends that I was like honestly worried about their gambling behavior. But none of my female friends ever really had yeah, showed. Maybe they were very secretive about it. So that's why I was curious. Anyway, I we've discussed a lot about yeah, gambling addiction and why some people are more likely to develop it, why it's so prevalent in today's society. But what are we doing for treatment? What does a successful treatment look like? Because it's different from alcohol or cocaine addiction in the sense that you're not addicted physically to a substance. Like usually with substance abuse, it's both a mental addiction and a physical addiction that you if for example, if you're used to drinking every single day and you just stop cold turkey, you don't have a drink, it might actually be dangerous physically to your body. However, gambling is different in that sense, in the sense that it's a mental addiction, at least how I understand it. So, what does treatment look like? How is it different from other sorts of addictions? And are there any developments in that regard?
So it's a great question. So again, as a addictive disorder, we use the principles of addiction treatment, biological treatments, psychological treatments, social treatments. Under the biological treatments, we do have certain medications that have been looked at, like naltrexone, opioid antagonist blocker, that can reduce and diminish some of the urges and cravings or the rewarding experiences of gambling. We have clinical trials underway right now looking at things like psilocybin and transcranial magnetic stimulation. There's a lot of excitement around the GLP-1 receptor agonists that we use for weight loss and alcohol use disorders. So there's a lot of medication options, again, when you treat other mental health conditions or substance use disorders that are running with the gambling at the same time. Like, say, ADHD is a common one. When you treat ADHD well, gambling disorder also goes down as well. So, psychological treatments, we have a wide variety of psychotherapies and different strategies that work that really help people navigate the journey of recovery, help them deal with urges and cravings, help them deal with triggers to gambling, help them stay motivated to work on repairing the consequences and harm that gambling created. A lot of times the patients will say, well, what can you say to me that's actually going to get me to stop gambling? And that's where our relationship with therapy, it's a safe space where we talk about a lot of things to help reduce the guilt, the shame, increase motivation. A lot of times what I do in psychotherapy is motivating folks to do the things that they've stopped doing because gambling took over their lives. So increase exercise, increase finding new hobbies I like to do, focusing on health, nutrition, focusing on sleep hygiene, just doing basic self-care, things they neglected because their addiction took those things away from them. And then social treatments for gambling. Of course, we have Gamblers Anonymous as a support fellowship for folks in recovery. We also have some like new online social products. We have mobile apps that can help people navigate their journey for gambling by having, discussion boards and podcasts that they can listen to. We have gambling blocking softwares that prevent them from going on their phone and getting to gambling websites, increasing, as you say, the friction between the itch to gamble and then actually placing a bet. So put it all together, I think people say, well, oftentimes they say, well, there's nothing a professional can tell me to do. I just had to do it myself. And that actually is not true. There's a lot of things we can do as healthcare professionals that we do similarly to the substance use disorder space. There are residential treatment programs for this. There are intensive outpatient programs. And I think, again, I think I had a patient say to me very well, what really helped Dr. Fong in my recovery was that I had a safe place to talk to someone who understood what I was going through. You didn't yell at
Hmm.
me, you didn't criticize me, you supported me, you identified other mental health conditions that were happening, and that allowed me the time and space and energy to do the work to find a better space so that I don't continue to gamble in a harmful
Yeah, and you briefly mentioned the psilocybin treatment for gambling as well. What does that look like?
So there's a colleague of mine, Dr. Pedro Romero, out of Gibraltar, out there in Europe, who was really interested in running a clinical trial of psilocybin for gambling disorder. We have some signals that psilocybin may be potentially effective in other addictive disorders like cocaine use disorder or alcohol or opioid use disorder. And it's a lot of a theory right now. We're not ready to declare it a effective treatment, but there's a possibility. And it just highlights that there's some interesting neuroscience work being done to say, how do we harness and understand what psilocybin can and can't do to the brain? And I think I'll just kind of leave it at there.
Super interesting. And finally, if people think that they have a problem with gambling, what should they do?
Oh, that's our, I'm not. So if people think, yeah. So if people think they
Getting
have
arrested.
let me back. If people are concerned or they're just curious about their own gambling behavior, or they're concerned they don't want it to advance to that problematic gambling, the first thing I always tell people is just get educated. If you're not ready to go see a professional gambling addiction specialist, you can do a lot of things online. You know, listen to podcasts. There's a number of gambling and recovery podcasts like the Broke Girl Society or All In or Voices or the Craig Carton Show that kind of just talk about what gambling addiction is and isn't, and they give you stories. And so, if you're curious and concerned, you can download these 24/7 from your home. But again, the general rule of thumb is that if you're really worried, or in particular, if you're worried about a family member or a friend, you got to get professional help, at least for an evaluation. That doesn't mean you need to go to a rehab or sign up for something major, but just get an evaluation. Just like any other medical condition, right? If you're concerned about your weight, or your risk factors for a heart attack, or you're worried about cancer, you'd want to see someone who knows about that. So, and the good news is anywhere in the world now that there are more and more gambling addiction treatment specialists. And at the very least, folks in behavioral health or mental health, or folks even in the primary care setting are learning more and more. If people are interested and want to know more about it, they can take a look at our website, UCLA And if they're in America, they can call the gambling helpline 24 hours a day, 1-800-GAMBLER or 1-800-MY-RESET will get you immediate care and support.
Great. I'll put it in the show notes for sure. Is there anything you would like to emphasize or anything that we didn't discuss that you would still like to mention before we wrap it up?
No, I think it's really, look, gambling is not a global phenomenon. Look, you're talking to me from Amsterdam and I'm here in LA, and it's as if we were sitting right next to each other, and we're impacted by some of the same issues of the day here. And I think that just shows you how our world has become so close in its similarities, but there's still so many interesting, unique cultural differences from place to place. But thank you so much for your time. And, I look forward to talking again at some point, and hopefully your listeners and viewers will take something out of it useful today.
Thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate it.